After about a year of waiting, the Security Breach Ruin DLC has finally come out. I streamed through the game on the day it released, and then I cut up the stream into a bunch of videos which by now have all come out. Thankfully, the DLC in my opinion did not disappoint. It definitely delivered on a much more eerie and creepy tone in contrast to the base Security Breach game, and it was really fun and delivered on some very interesting lore, which is what we'll be talking about today. With the DLC now out and many of the secrets revealed, it's time to do a theory on the DLC. I don't want to waste any more time, let's just immediately get started on the lore of the Ruin DLC. In the Ruin DLC, we play as a little girl named Cassie who is called to the Pizzaplex by Gregory, of course our player character in the base Security Breach game. However, as she enters the Pizzaplex, she finds that this supposed old place is extremely run down and has cracks throughout the whole thing, holes everywhere, and the animatronics are completely ruined. She maneuvers through the Pizzaplex, shutting off security nodes to shut down the security by the sinkhole under the raceway, which is where Gregory is supposedly trapped. However, throughout the DLC, we get many hints that Gregory isn't as he seems. Towards the beginning of the game, we get a Vanny mask which allows us to warp through objects, get exclusively AR collectibles, and find secrets, but it also makes us vulnerable to a glitchy rabbit which summons the animatronics to our position. It's kinda like FNaF 3 in a lot of ways, with the glitch rabbit being kinda like the phantoms, not to mention the audio lures on the cameras. However, when we use those audio lures, the AI in the mask, Helpy, tells us that the audio we lure the animatronics with was created by compiling different clips of Cassie's voice. Throughout the DLC, we actually hear a lot of Gregory's voice lines are the exact same archived lines that he said in areas of Security Breach. Not just the same sentence similarly said, but the exact same way.
What? How is that supposed to help? There's no time. What? How is that supposed to help?
Chica loves pizza.
There's no time. I'm fine.
Some of these lines are recycled, I can tell, because they're the same. They're exactly the same.
Correct!
There's also a section where Roxy hears Gregory's voice and goes chasing after him, and Gregory assures Cassie that he found a spot to hide. However, Gregory has already said that he was trapped in the sinkhole, meaning Roxy was nowhere near him.
I found a spot to hide.
Didn't he say he was in the sinkhole? So he just... Okay, I'm sorry. He just exposed himself as being a liar. Because she's not close. You said you're in the sinkhole, bro. Okay, I'm sorry, what did he say to do? This was very suspicious of him, but even more strangely, many of his voice lines later in the game start sounding kind of robotic and unnatural. Yeah, this is Roxy Raceway. We're back.
Hear me? I finally have a clear signal. Gregory.
No, you don't. I heard your voice crack there.
I'm in the
I finally have a clear signal.
Almost.
Almost like he's a robot. When we make it under the Pizzaplex, we can find a cave with a waterfall which leads us into the remnants of the FNaF 6 location, where we find Candy Cadet who tells us a story before we head down to the Burn Trap boss fight area. Making our way through and under, we deactivate the security system, seeing the glitch bunny trying to grab us before getting sucked back into the machine it came out of. Then we go through the now broken down wall and find that it wasn't Gregory all along. It was an endoskeleton with a rectangular-ish head, exposed wires, white eyes, and orange glowing from those eyes. It reaches out to grab us before Roxy jumps in and saves us. We run out of the room, passing costumes around us, and speak to Gregory, the real Gregory, who explains that he's not at the Pizzaplex. The endoskeleton was trying to trick Cassie and lure her in. The endoskeleton seems to incapacitate Roxy before coming towards us and chasing us through the caves. Gregory directs us to go right the entire time, and we do before getting into an elevator. The endoskeleton tries to grab us, but as the elevator goes, its arm breaks off, and Gregory explains the situation as the elevator starts going up. He and Vanessa had escaped a while ago, and they had installed a security program called MXES, or Mixes, to keep this endoskeleton at bay, but throughout the game, we'd been deactivating the security nodes, deactivating the security protocol, deactivating Mixes, allowing the endoskeleton to escape. Gregory tells Cassie that they can't risk being followed and makes the elevator crash, ending the DLC. However, her story doesn't seem to be over, and we hear Roxy's voice calling her name after the credits, and that's the end. First things first, let's talk about the elephant in the room, in some ways literally, the endoskeleton. The endoskeleton is trapped underneath the FNaF 6 location, has exposed wires, white eyes with orange glowing out of them, and a rectangular-ish shaped head, and it can also speak in Gregory's voice and does so to lure Cassie to him so he can kill her. We also see in his jump scare that he seems to rip off Cassie's arms and then go for her head. This is 100% undeniably the Mimic. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it's actually referred to as the Mimic in the files. I may be wrong, but that's what I've heard. But what I do know is that the endoskeleton speaking in Gregory's voice is named Grimmick in the files. Gregory Mimic. The only difference between Mimic here and in Tales from the Pizzaplex is the lack of rabbit ears, but those could have easily broken off. The Mimic in Tales is said to have white eyes that glow orange, a vaguely rectangular shaped head, and it rips off the limbs and heads of things that are shaped like endoskeletons, including humans. Not only that, but it also mimics voices through a radio to call out to the teenagers in the epilogues, trying to lure them towards him so that he can rip off their limbs and heads too. The Mimic in Tales and the Mimic in Ruin are the same animatronic. There's even another ending in Ruin where if you activate the 4 secret cameras throughout the game, when you make it to the Mimic, it's actually wearing a costume. And we can also vaguely see in the game, and better in Full Bright and or Out of Bounds, that there's actually other costumes in the room with the Mimic, including a bird and an elephant in the room, hence my joke a minute ago. In the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues, the Mimic also commonly wears costumes. There's more to do with that ending, and the other one, which I'll discuss in another video, but for right now, I want to focus on the Mimic itself. Throughout FNaF, there's been quite a few design inconsistencies, but most of them are either not really that inconsistent because of lore reasons, or relatively minor, or both, like the designs of the Wizards and the Classics being different because the animatronics were repaired and remodeled after FNaF 2, or Scraptrap being different from Springtrap because of Remnant regenerating parts of Afton's body, and him getting a new suit, or at the very least repairing his old one with a new one. Things like this have lore explanations that fix the inconsistency, but while many people previously and many still believe that the Mimic is the endoskeleton for Burntrap, I personally don't think that's the case. As I just said, while designs can be inconsistent, there's always a lore reason or it's pretty minor, but this endoskeleton and this endoskeleton look nothing alike. There's a couple similarities like the claws on the left hand and overall having pretty thin limbs, but that's where the similarities end. The Mimic is colored a gray color and has white orange glowing eyes, while Burntrap's endoskeleton is entirely an extremely dark, almost black gray color, and the parts of Burntrap are more similar to that of a Glamrock endoskeleton, having entirely different shapes with the rings around the arms and legs. A couple of those exist on the Mimic, but only like 2 on one leg, and a bunch of much differently designed ones on the other. Also, while the Mimic does seem to have flesh on his legs, they're not distributed in any of the spots that they were on Burntrap, and somehow all of the flesh from Burntrap, not to even mention the bunny costume, is completely gone. The Mimic here is for some reason not wearing a Springlock suit, but instead is wearing a cloth suit like Glitchtrap, who is also the Mimic, but while that suit is an Afton suit, it's not a Springlock one. The Mimic and Burntrap are not the same character. There's also something that is a bit hard to distinguish, but it looks to be either hair or a piece of cloth. If it is to be hair, then that would mean that Epilogue 7 was not telling us that the flesh on Burntrap is Kelly's, but rather that the flesh on the Mimic is Kelly's. And if it's hair on the Mimic, then it's probably Kelly's, and since that doesn't exist on Burntrap, that means that they must be different. If it's cloth, then that wouldn't really debunk the Mimic being Burntrap, as it could have just gotten that from one of the costumes, but I just don't think the other stuff is minor enough to ignore. Hell, the Mimic also has 2 completely different arms and 2 completely different legs, and I don't think that when Gregory and Vanessa came down here that they decided, before they trapped the arm-tearing endoskeleton, that they should give him a makeover. Burntrap has 2 of the exact same arm and 2 of the exact same leg, but the Mimic doesn't. The different arms and legs actually make total sense if we go back to the Mimic's story. The Mimic was really beat up, which is why Team A, who was sent to Edwin's factory, decided to repair the Mimic, giving it legs, which now makes sense to be 2 different legs, and generally repairing it, meaning one of the things they did to repair it could have been giving him a new arm, but one different to the one that he already had. What all this means is that Burntrap could still have William Afton's corpse rather than Kelly's, since that's on the Mimic. Would this mean that William is possessing Burntrap? Maybe, but he doesn't have to be. He could very well still be trapped in Ultimate Custom Night and dormant, or depending on belief, he could just be gone. Maybe he's possessing Burntrap, but if his body is the one on Burntrap, that doesn't mean that he has to be possessing it. This also doesn't render the Mimic useless, because the Mimic is still Glitchtrap, and he's still controlling everything in the Pizzaplex, or at least he was before Ruin, but because while the Mimic isn't Burntrap, the Mimic still is Burntrap. Let me explain. In the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues, it's revealed that while Edwin created the Mimic, Fazbear Entertainment then used the program and the concept to create a Mimic Model 2, which they used for stuff we don't know. However, we know that the Mimic Model 2 does the same thing, would probably have a couple of the same design details like maybe teeth, claws, and things like that, but would also have more features like a work mode. When the Mimic was delivered to the under construction Pizzaplex, it's noted that its head looks brand new, implying that Fazbear Entertainment replaced the head of the original Mimic with the head of a Model 2, which is likely where the functions like the work mode are, which is why the Mimic in the epilogues even has that work mode. But while these Mimic Model 2s were created sometime before the events of FNaF 6, which we know from the fact that the blueprints of them were found in FNaF 6, it's very possible that those Mimic Model 2s were actually used in production for the Glamrock animatronics. Consider the fact that the Glamrock animatronic endos are really big and bulky, but even in characters as small as Chica or even the daycare attendant, it still fits. The reason it fits is because the Mimic endoskeletons are able to expand and contract to fit into any space, which we can actually see the function of on the Mimic in Ruin itself, where we can see a sort of mechanism of the endoskeleton where the arms and seemingly the legs are able to collapse in on themselves. Kinda like the lightsaber I have. It's possible that Glamrock animatronics have this too, since there are a lot of nooks and crannies on the endos that I'm sure would be able to collapse to shrink. But remember how I said that the Mimic Model 1 has a Mimic Model 2's head? Take a look at the Mimic's teeth close up. Notice anything familiar? Probably not at first, but I want you to compare it with the teeth of the daycare attendant. It's the same. While the other Glamrock endos aren't entirely the same as the Mimic's head, it's a similar general shape, and while the teeth on them don't seem to be the same as the Mimic, I find it really interesting that the daycare attendant does have those teeth. The daycare attendant is very differently shaped compared to the other endoskeletons, so whatever endoskeleton Fazbear Entertainment equipped him with after they retrieved him from that stage show he was originally part of is probably a differently designed Glamrock endo, and the head of the one that they equipped the Mimic with could very well be one of those types. So while I was kind of implying earlier that the Glamrock endos were Mimic Model 2s, I don't really think that's the case. I think instead, the Glamrock endos could be a sort of Mimic Model 3, and that is the endoskeleton that Birdtrap is using. Technically speaking, the Mimic controls Birdtrap, unless Afton is also controlling him, which is again debatable, but the Mimic is not the actual endoskeleton for Birdtrap. I feel like this explanation works pretty well, and it answers some of the similarities that the Mimic does actually have with Birdtrap, of which there are very few, those being the claws as well as the way that he moves with one arm out like Birdtrap does. Besides that, there's not really anything similar about them, which is why, as I said, I don't think that they are one and the same, but Birdtrap still being a Mimic actually makes sense. And as I said, the Mimic is still controlling him, since Birdtrap has the Glitch Trap virus, which is the Mimic, as I've talked about in many videos in the past. If it weren't for another secret in Ruin, I would say that we were right all along about what Birdtrap's endoskeleton was, that being Glamrock Bonnie. However, in a difficult Easter egg to get in the game, you can actually find Glamrock Bonnie behind the scenes in Bonnie Bowl, and we actually see that he still has his endoskeleton, so it's not the endoskeleton for Birdtrap. I actually made a whole YouTube short about Glamrock Bonnie yesterday, so definitely check that out if you haven't yet. It's obviously a YouTube short, so it won't lose you any significant time, so give it a watch if you want to. The next thing I wanted to talk about is Candy Cadet and the story that he tells us. I'll play that story as well as my reaction to it right now. What happened to Candy Cadet? He's telling me a story.
About a mother and a little boy who lived alone in a cabin in the dark woods.
Okay, tell me.
There was a monster in the woods.
Oh, that's what the coins are for!
It locked in the basement. The monster always made scary noises at night, but the mother would tell the boy not to worry because it could never get out. Then she would sing the boy a lullaby to sleep. One day, the monster stopped growling and instead listened and learned the lullaby. The next day, when Mother went out to find food, the monster sang the lullaby from the basement. The little boy heard the lullaby and opened
Subscriber, thanks. What? Okay, so there's a little boy lives with his mother in a cabin in the woods, and there's a monster. There's a monster nearby, and then she sings a lullaby, and then the monster hears the lullaby, and then it repeats it. It mimics it, guys. Yeah, he's mimicking, exactly. But what does this story mean? I think it's pretty easy to recognize that the story is about the Mimic, but I just wanted to explain exactly how. In Candy Cadet's story, the mother represents Gregory, the little boy represents Cassie, and the monster represents the Mimic. The mother traps the monster in the basement, but then the monster learns the mother's lullaby, and when the mother is not in the cabin, he uses it to lure the little boy to the basement. Gregory, along with Vanessa, trap the Mimic under the Pizzaplex, but the Mimic learns Gregory's voice, and when Gregory is no longer in the Pizzaplex, he uses it to lure Cassie under the Pizzaplex. But another interesting thing about Ruin is that Gregory's voice is not the only one that was mimicked. At the beginning of the game, Helpy mimics Cassie's voice using samples of it. This was of course an early hint at Gregory not really being Gregory. However, it's also a big hint that Helpy is actually the Mimic in the form of Glitchtrap infecting this Vanny mask with the Glitchtrap virus. This also makes sense since the Mix's security program, the Glitch Bunny we see throughout the game, was made to defend against the Mimic, and it attacks us when we wear the mask, trying to stop us from disabling him and trying to stop us from reaching the Mimic. What's more interesting is that Grimmick, which remember is the Mimic using the voice of Gregory, works with Helpy, and both of them antagonize Mixes, telling us that Helpy is the Mimic too. And if you really think about it, Mixes summons the animatronics to us, meaning that they are not controlled by the Mimic anymore. They're simply animatronic AIs wandering the Pizzaplex. This is furthered by the fact that Roxy doesn't attack Cassie except when she thinks that Cassie is Gregory, because he literally took her eyes, as she says. It's also interesting that the animatronics don't really attack us before we get the Vanny mask either. Chica grabs us and then shuts down, like she thought we would be Gregory and then realized we weren't, so she didn't care anymore. And Monty kinda just bumps into us in that pipe and then doesn't try to kill us afterwards. Even if we ignore this, it could just be the Mix's protocol sending them after us because it knows what Grimmick is doing and knows what Cassie is trying to do. The animatronics only start attacking us when we wear the Vanny mask, which has Helpy in it, which is Glitchtrap, and the mask also allows us to deactivate the nodes, which helps the Mimic. The last thing I want to talk about for this video is when security breach actually takes place. I've discussed this many times in videos, and more recently I've talked about how the game takes place in 2029 because the Mimic takes place in 1984 and is 40 years before the Storyteller, which is at the beginning of the Pizzaplex's lifespan, and the Fast Life magazine suggests the Pizzaplex has been open for 5 years. However, what I for some reason never really thought that much about was the fact that it's entirely possible that the Fast Life magazine started years after the Pizzaplex first opened. It must have been open for at least 5 years, or technically 4.75 years, and the Pizzaplex still had to have opened in 2024, but the Fast Life magazines could have started years after it opened, 6 years to be exact. See, there's a calendar in Security Breach that narrows down potential years that Security Breach can be in. 2029 is of course one of them, but the most popular option for when Security Breach takes place is 2035, which is also one of the options. It's entirely possible that Security Breach does take place in 2035, especially because of that Fred Masquerade picture, and the Fast Life magazines only started in 2030. However, the reason I'm bringing this up in this video is because Ruin actually suggests that the Pizzaplex has been open for more than 5 years. When we get into the daycare, there's gifts that talk about how Cassie has spent time in the daycare, and given she's probably around the same age as Gregory, which is probably around 12 or so, she would not have been young enough to have been in the daycare if the Pizzaplex only opened 5 years prior, meaning Security Breach almost definitely did take place in 2035. Believe me, there's still a bunch more stuff to talk about with Ruin. In fact, there was more that I wanted to talk about in this video, but decided to save it for a separate video because there was a bit more about it to discuss than I thought there was. So the next video will be all about the AR stuff, the canon ending, Princess Quest, and stuff like that, so stay tuned for the next Ruin theory. I still have a bunch more content surrounding Ruin planned for the near future, so if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and stay tuned for any upcoming uploads. But I do hope you guys did enjoy this video, and let me know in the comments what you think of Ruin. Also, let me know what you think about this theory, and if you don't agree with it, then let me know what theories you have regarding stuff I bring up in this video. But that's everything for this video, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye, guys!
Leave that part in the video.
No.
Why?
Because you can barely see it. The lamp is broken, so there's no light, so you can't see anything.